Yeah, well, thank you, everybody, for coming and giving me this opportunity to rehearse these ideas for my own benefit as well as yours. Um, I guess you have had some introduction as to who I am. I teach at Central Michigan University here in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, but I've had the good fortune to stumble into some classes with Jeffrey Hopkins back in the 1970s and be drawn into studying Tibetan and studying with Tibetan, a number of different Tibetan scholars in the Gyaltsen lineage. Through the workings of karma and so forth, I ended up having the opportunity to participate in this big project to translate Tsongkhapa's great treatise on stages of the path to enlightenment, which Tsongkhapa wrote in 1402, and to be one of the editors on that project. And doing that was a condition for His Holiness to agree to come and teach that text in the United States. He had said that he would do it, and he had come to the United States many times, but he wouldn't do it unless there was a complete, reliable English translation available to the audience. So once it became available, then he did come and taught at Lehigh and University, and then I had the opportunity to edit his oral teachings from that, which was a great honor. So along the way, I have had to study Tsongkhapa's writings quite a bit and try to figure out, exactly what do the passages, the more technical passages to do with emptiness in that text mean. And I figured out a great many things with the assistance of my lamas. And so, of course, what I've tried to do is figure out a way to talk about those things and write about those things in a more accessible way. It's not to say it cannot really be made, it cannot be made simple, but it can be made clearer, if you understand what I mean. The distinctions that Tsongkhapa makes, the subtle distinctions he makes, in my opinion, had never been made before as to exactly what is the nature of reality. Of course, he understood himself as explaining what Chandrakirti had explained, and Chandrakirti understood himself as explaining what Nagarjuna explained, and Nagarjuna understood himself as, teaching in a more profound way what the Buddha had intended than had been taught before. So it's not that the view is new, but the subtlety of making distinctions that articulate the view so it doesn't come across as some sort of contradiction or paradox, but can be explained as something that's logically intelligible. Those distinctions, in my opinion, were first made, spelled out is the best way to say it, by Tsongkhapa in 1402. So for me, understanding that was a huge benefit, because before that, you always end up in these kinds of situations where you have some sort of paradox, so that, like, all beings are empty and therefore in reality don't exist, and yet we must do everything possible, sacrifice our own flesh and so forth in order to save these apparently non-existent beings, or something like that, right? People will go too quickly to say, the Dharma is inexpressible, and the right way to understand it is to just abide in not knowing, or to abide in thoughtlessness, right? And this is the kind of thing that Tsongkhapa was pushing very hard back against. So I'm gonna talk to you quite a bit more over the top of a PowerPoint, which I will now, the host needs to allow me to share.
Yes. Okay, there you go.
Thank you. Okay, so this is, you know, me. It doesn't come from any other book, but I think what the basic message of the Buddhist tradition is can be summed up, you know, as succinctly as we suffer needlessly because we don't see things as they are. And we suffer needlessly, and all these other beings suffer needlessly because they don't see things as they are. We don't see things realistically. Now, we know that to be a Buddhist means taking refuge in the three jewels, and the metaphor for what it means to take refuge is the medical metaphor, that the Buddha is the doctor, the Dharma. This will relate, you'll see. The Dharma is the medicine, the Sangha is the nurses, and so forth. So for most Buddhists, and not for all, and we'll come back to that, maybe not even today, but in one of the other sessions, for most Buddhists, this medical metaphor is means in effect that the Dharma is the most important of the three refuges, because if you follow through the metaphor, it's like it's not our personal relationship with Buddha, like an evangelical Christian would say, you know, they're saved through their personal relationship with Jesus Christ. So, you know, there may be types of Buddhism where, you know, people think of their relationship to Buddha that way, but it's unusual, right? And really, we respect Buddha as the teacher slash doctor who gave us the teaching slash medicine, the healing teaching of the Dharma, right? And likewise, by extension, the Sangha, they're there not because of their intrinsic qualities, but because of their ability to help us in learning and practicing the Dharma and using the medicine that was prescribed by Dr. Buddha. If you think about this, like this is the way I teach my students, is that, you know, we don't necessarily come from prior background and traditions where we think of, you know, use this medical metaphor, but it's very fundamental in the Buddhist way of looking at the world. And if you start to look at, you know, the Dharma as a medicine that's prescribed by Buddha, then you realize that a good doctor doesn't just have one medicine. That would be a bad doctor, right? And so there's going to be like a lot of different medicines in the Dharma pharmacy. This is what, like, so we think of the Dharma pharmacy is going to have some, you know, if you have a regular pharmacy, you'll have some medicine for diarrhea and some very, very different medicine for constipation, right? So likewise, you know, you have medicines that would be toxic or poisonous for some people, and but are just the thing that the other person needs. So my point is that, you know, the Dharma pharmacy has many different things in it, and most Buddhists understand this. Looking around at the Buddhist landscape, they see the diversity of teachings within their own world, and the usual move to make is to say, yes, these are all important teachings that are helpful to many people, although in the end, in the long run, once they're adequately prepared through these more preliminary medicines, they will need to take our medicine here because ours is ultimately the best, right? And so that's the way it usually works. So taking refuge in the Dharma is taking refuge in relying upon an extraordinary experience that can begin to eradicate or root out for good the tendency to see things as other than they are. That's why we're suffering needlessly, is because we're not seeing things as they are. But in order to get to that kind of non-dual liberating vision, and this is, Tsongkhapa's view, we have to first rely on some verbal and conceptual expressions of the Dharma. Not necessarily every Buddhist would say that, but this is definitely the Gyaltsen tradition. So why do we have to? Because we need an antidote, we need a curing medicine that directly opposes the mistake that's at the root of our suffering. And the mistake is not just having thoughts. The mistake is a very particular kind of thought or approach to the world, right? That the idea that the things around us somehow stand on their own, exist by way of their own power, are able to set themselves up. And that this is true of us as well. And we don't usually consciously think like that. But if you reflect on your behavior, you can begin to uncover how there are these kinds of attitudes about how the various objects around us that are constructed, right? We take them in our ordinary life as though they were not constructed, but just naturally existed from their own side in and of themselves as whatever it is they're appearing to us to be. So in terms of verbal expressions of the Dharma, they're all dualistic, right? And yet the ultimate liberating experience is completely non-dualistic. And this leads a whole bunch of people to say the problem is that we're thinking too much, and we have too many thoughts. And if we could just stop thinking, right, and be or become or something, right, then we would transcend the dualism of language and thought. Yeah. So there was a Zen master, a Chan master, actually, a 20th century Chan master, who said that this view is wrong. That what you realize, through the practice is not just the sheer absence of thought. Because if it were, the Chan master, could just come up behind you and give you a good whack on the head and stop your thinking process and thereby liberate you, right? So, meditation can't be just an elaborate process of making ourselves unconscious, right? Because there are easier ways to attain unconsciousness, right? So it has to be based on, it has to have be an insight into some kind of wisdom or understanding. It has to have some sort of content, right? And if you first identify conceptually and linguistically the opposite of the wrong thought that is at the basis of our misery, right, then you can go into having more and more non-dualistic, gradually more and more non-dualistic experiences of that wisdom. So I am making up, for the sake of this series of talks, the idea that there are three visions or three main ways of talking in Buddhism to guide people toward a liberating, non-dualistic vision of the profound reality. So this list of three is a construct that comes from me. It doesn't directly correspond to the three turnings of the wheel or to anything else. It really emerges from my study of a lot of different Tibetan Madhyamaka texts. As I mentioned, my grounding is in the Gyaltsen text, but I've had occasion now to read the ways in which people from many different centuries in many different Churluk, many different Dharma traditions of Tibet talk about the profound reality and what it would take to become a Buddha. And I've tried to distill that in the way I've tried to do, clarify other things. So in the process, it does maybe be somewhat oversimplified, but I think that it's useful, right, to think about these three ways. And this is what I have as the idea of organizing these talks around. The idea that the profound reality is the lack or absence, the sheer non-presence in things of some distorted kind of existence that is in itself, in fact, impossible. And this lack or absence exists, and it's called emptiness or no self. And it's taken in this view to be the ultimate reality, the profound nature of things, what it is that we realize, and what it is that when we realize it non-dualistically and perfectly clearly, we begin to root out the delusion that's at the basis of cyclic existence. So that's the view that Tsongkhapa holds, and it's a view that the Dalai Lama holds, and it's a view that I find most compatible with my own mind, and it's of course the one that I've studied by far the most. But yeah, then there are other ways of talking, and the second one is that there is a profound liberating reality. It is not an absence or lack, it's the presence in every single living being of an inherent perfection, right? It's not a lack of inherent existence, it's a presence of inherent perfection, right? And you can do all kinds of things like that with that, like try to explain how these are two different ways of saying the same thing, or you can say, obviously, one of them is wrong, right? and yeah, you can find lots of different people in Tibetan Buddhism doing both of those things, or some version of that. And then there's the other one, which is the idea that the profound reality that realization of which is liberation is not accessible to words and thoughts at all. We can't even call it, of course, the first two views all say that, the non-dualistic realization of profound reality is inexpressible and ineffable. And so, it goes beyond words and language and so forth. They all say that. But at the same time, they're saying these are the words that you need as stepping stones to get you there. Whereas the third view is sort of emphasizes this inexpressibility or transcendence of all dualistic categories. So, for example, you might say that it's neither existence nor non-existence. It's neither self nor not self. It's neither attainment nor non-attainment, right? And so you can see that is a way that the Heart Sutra is talking. Some passages in the Heart Sutra are just like that, right? And other passages are more in line with the emptiness view. And this isn't just true of that particular sutra that we just read. You can find passages in the first turning of the wheel, the Pali Canon, the scriptures of Theravada Buddhism. You can find passages in there that point to or strongly suggestive of each of these three views. Okay. So I'm gonna be focusing on today, and probably next time as well, the view of Tsongkhapa. So that's the view that's listed here as number one. Yeah, so I just said that. It's very clear that Buddhist teachings include all these different kinds of things. And then it's like the Dharma pharmacy, right? Some people find themselves benefited by one or the other of these according to their predispositions. And then they come to regard the other ones as, true teachings of the Buddha, but ones that require interpretation or are stepping stones to help people who are not prepared to hear the most profound expression of the truth. Yeah, and so sometimes they say mean things about each other. Like, yeah, sometimes they call each other names, right? It can become unpleasant. So there isn't one right medicine. This is how I would see it. There's not the medicine that is perfect for everybody. Words, ways of talking, philosophical views. I have my preferences. I know what ways are helpful for me to think, but they're all means. You understand? None of them are the goal or the reality or the actuality itself. They're not what we're trying to get to. So since people are coming from different places, right? Then people are coming to the Shantideva Center from different parts of town. Then some people will have to go east and some people will have to go west, obviously, right? Just like that. So emptiness is a word. This is something important. Seems like religion. I'm a professor of religion, and so people think that I should be able to give a definition of religion. But yeah, I'll always say, hey, remember, this is a word that's made up, to talk about. It's a word that we use when it's useful, and different people find it useful in different ways, right? So I think that that's important to remember. So the Dalai Lama is, great inspiration for me in this regard. It's clear that he is not just a staunch Buddhist, and I'm quoting him there, but he's also a staunch Gelugpa. He very strongly holds the view that Tsongkhapa was teaching in 1402. But he's not fixated on it in the sense of saying, and this is the only way people should be allowed to talk, and otherwise it's not Buddhism. He doesn't say things like that. And there, unfortunately, are some people who do talk like that, right? Yeah. So he has a solid grounding, and his own home view is emptiness, but he can see well how the Buddha taught many different things and how it's reasonable and helpful for others to use different words to talk about and to set the stage, for practice that leads to liberation. So yeah, obviously my view is that we'll look at each of these three approaches to the profound reality as medicines in the Dharma pharmacy, and consider, I think, that like any medicine, each of these three views could have not only benefits, but also counterindications and side effects. That is, so I'm going to stick with the medical thing here. See, so there could be situations where teaching emptiness to people is unhelpful. And this is widely recognized, right, in the Buddhist tradition, right? It's understood that teaching emptiness can be harmful to some people. And so therefore, yeah, you have to be, since I'm not clairvoyant, you have to some sense, be self-screening, right? And if this way of talking, is unhelpful to you or undermines your confidence, that things make a difference, that what you do makes a difference, then you have to find some different kind of medicine. And also it can have side effects. There are any way you talk introduces some kinds of distortions. So Tsongkhapa is, making things as absolutely clear and beyond contradiction or paradox as he possibly can. But not, this has its own problems, which we won't get into now, but in other words, there are problems that come about precisely because Gyaltsen is insisting that everything has to be able to be made sense of in logic. All right. So, and of course, at the same time as I'm stepping back and trying to look at these different views from the outside, I'm personally also, like you, one of the patients, taking refuge. And I have my own preference for the emptiness view, because that's really what I've, found most powerful and have spent a lot of time trying to understand and clarify for other people. But before we go on into talking more about emptiness, which I definitely am going to do, I think we should talk about what is the point of all of studying emptiness? Clearly, the point is to have a non-dualistic experience whereby we begin to root out the basic misconception that underlies all our suffering. But in just putting it like that, it comes across as quite self-centered. So the point of all spiritual practice ought to be not just to attain, superpowers or special, cool, altered states of consciousness, but to become a kinder person, right? So I'm paraphrasing His Holiness the Dalai Lama here. So whatever kind of practice you're doing, if after a couple of years you find that, in examining yourself, that you aren't becoming more kind, then you should consider doing a different practice. Because everything that we do should tend in one way or another to help us open our hearts, right, to care for all sentient beings. I don't know how old His Holiness was in this picture, but he's quite a bit older now. And you can see Thupten Jimba back here in the background. I like that picture. Yeah, so he said kindness is my religion. I didn't make it up. So it's not the case that His Holiness shares this dedication to the practice of kindness with all people, obviously, whether religious or not. There are people in different cultures all around the world who would agree that it's really all about kindness in the end. But lots of people can, there are people who use the religious scriptures to justify slavery in the history of the United States, for example. And in the Buddhist tradition, there's also this kind of, use of the words of the Dharma in ways that justify war or violence. And there are many different examples of that, but everybody's probably, an example that's pretty familiar is the close connection between the Rinzai Zen tradition and the samurai. So in that regard, Robert Aitken Roshi, said, even Mara can quote scripture, right? And it's like, just because people are quoting the words of the Dharma doesn't mean that they're really using them to point toward peace and kindness. And at the same time, even though not all religious people and not all Buddhists actually have a religion that's centered on kindness, on the other hand, There are lots of people who aren't religious at all that do center their way of life around kindness. So by kindness, I'm meaning a ready disposition to enact care for others. Okay, these are the words that I like to use. You notice that I haven't said compassion yet, so I'll get to that next. Why do I talk about kindness instead of compassion? So the Buddha in the Karaniya Metta Sutta says, even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings. I like to quote this, and there's other texts like this that make it clear that the caring for other beings in a bodhisattva-like way isn't something that's unique to Mahayana. And it's also true that thinking that we shouldn't be hateful towards other beings because, as far as we know, they could all have been our mothers in the past, that also is not a distinctly Mahayana idea. And in fact, you don't even find it in Shantideva's Bodhisattvacharya Avatara. And you do find it in the Theravada text, Visuddhimagga, the Path of Purification. Of course, it does appear in other Mahayana texts, but we think of, Shantideva as the Bodhisattva teaching, par excellence. I guess it is, but it doesn't actually use the reasoning of all beings having been our mother in the past. That occurs elsewhere. So, kindness, apparently Proto-German root kunjam, meaning family. So kind and kin are related. This family-ishness, right? Recognizing others as our intimate relations is embedded in the word kindness, is what I'm trying to say. A natural sense of care that one would extend to another human being with whom one feels a sense of intimacy. And this is the, this is the Chinese character for Ren, which means, I don't know, it translates benevolence, human-heartedness, right? And so, right, the radical on the left is the symbol for human, and then we obviously have the ideogram for the two lines on the right. So it's person to person, this person, human-heartedness, right? And my point is that just in Chinese, just as there is in Proto-German or English, there's this idea that's the same as the idea of, that we see in the quote I just gave from Buddha, of thinking about the care as something that's based on a recognition of an intimate kinship with one another, right? And so I managed to say all that without really talking about compassion. So this is, of course, the word that we usually use to talk about these things, karuna in Sanskrit. I don't have my diacritics going in this PowerPoint. So it's kir, from the kir means, is the Sanskrit root for to do, to act, to make. And it's, so my point is karuna, the word that we usually translate compassion, and almost everybody usually translates compassion. It doesn't come from roots that mean feeling together with others or having a feeling that goes along with others. It comes from a root that means to do something, to take action, right? And then the word we use in Tibetan, the word that's translated from Tibetan as compassion, usually nyingche, and nying means heart, right? And je means the best or foremost, right? So the best kind of heart, or I guess His Holiness sometimes has said the good heart, is what more literally what we usually translate as compassion. So I think that the compassion comes across a little bit too much having to do with the emotional side. And it's like, well, how can we actually have compassion for every single living being, right? Becomes a challenge to understand. But what we could have is like a genuine disposition of loving kindness towards other beings. And of course we have empathy and compassion and love for many of those beings, but we don't simultaneously necessarily, you know, have the ability to contain all of these emotions. So that's why I was like thinking that to emphasize that karuna or ningche is kindness. It's what moves us to act, to care for others, right? So this great little verse from the first Panchen Lama: no amount of suffering is too small for me. No amount of happiness is too great. And no amount of suffering is too small for me. No amount of happiness is too great for me. Everyone is just like this, right? So yeah, the recognition that just as like we're pretty particular about our comfort, and it's not just us. There's no reason. It's like when I get this feeling when I start to think about this is like, I don't know what it really means to be this particular person versus being another person. It's hard to pin down what exactly that is, right? Where we happen to be like looking out from inside this body, but there's not any objective reason to constantly prefer the comfort of this body over the comfort of other bodies. Right? People just act as though that were perfectly reasonable, but it's not reasonable. There's no actual justification for it, which is clear if you think about taking a case to court and saying, you know, I have the right to be completely comfortable, even if it makes that person uncomfortable. And it's like, why? Well, because I'm uncomfortable. I mean, it's not a reason, right? There's no argument or justification for it. Everybody has, you know, this is in the same situation. And it's a situation that involves a lot of misery and loss and suffering that we like to not think about too much. And the Buddhist tradition, and you know, invites us to look these things more directly and recognize that it's not just trauma and suffering and loss that is our common condition. You know, that knits us together in this intimacy, right? That the family all has pain, but also vulnerability. You know, even when we're not having a bad day, right? We could start having a horrible day at any moment for so many different reasons that you can't count. Our temporary comfort is like very constantly vulnerable. As there's a famous poem that Naomi Shahunai says, before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you have to know sorrow as the other deepest thing. Yeah, you have to recognize, you know, you have to know suffering and misery and then see that that's what we share with others in a fundamental way. And Thoreau said something similar too. You see, not until we've really lost the world do we begin to find ourselves and real, you know, by lost the world, meaning the whole world of meaning that you think you live in is destroyed because you've built it up around having a certain job or having a relationship with a certain person, right? And that world is destroyed. Then you have this opportunity to see how deeply connected you are in that vulnerability and misery to every other single being, you know, the infinite extent of our relations, as he's saying. So the Buddha in the Pali Canon takes care of a monk named Tissa who is horribly ill and whom the other monks are not caring for. And the Buddha personally goes and takes care of him as he's dying. And then, how do you say, maybe gently reproaches the other monks and saying, you know, if we don't care for one another, then who will? Now, we're all in this together. We try to maintain an illusion that we're not, but it won't work in the end. Yeah. So we all suffer needlessly because we don't see things, including ourselves, as they are. And therefore, we can't really be effectively kind in the long run if we don't, if we ourselves don't see things as they are. So part of being truly kind is being motivated to being more effective at being kind. It's not a matter of having really, really, really good intentions, right? It's a matter of intending to figure out how we can be better helpers. You're right. And it's not always the case that we have all the tools to help people who are suffering. We may see someone who's suffering and we may not know or actually have the ability. It may be that our best efforts will be counterproductive and be irritating to them, right? Right. It's not just ineptly giving first aid to somebody on the side of the road and actually damaging them worse. It's not just that. There's the psychological equivalent of that too, right? Where we go and, you know, say something about impermanence to the wrong person, right? Or something about emptiness to the person for whom that's the wrong medicine at that time. Right. So to be kind, you should be motivated to be more effectively kind. And that means you have to learn all kinds of things. And that's why the Sutra version of the Mahayana path is so long, because, you know, you have to learn Robert's Rules of Order, and you have to learn how to fix a motorcycle, and you have to learn, right? And it's like, there's so many things that could potentially be just what you needed to know in order to be helpful in certain situations. And so, you know, you have to think about, well, what can I do in this lifetime? What kinds of talents do I have? What kinds of opportunities do I have to increase my ability to be effectively kind? But of course, we know that the root of people's suffering is that they don't see things as they are. So if we can try to understand how things that understand things as they are, right, then to the extent that we can help other people understand it, that's a particularly helpful kind of kindness, I guess. Okay. So Tsongkhapa's approach, or, you know, approach number one in general, the emptiness approach, there is a correct way to see things. It's not a matter of just not thinking or not seeing. There is a correct way to see things. And then in order to see things in that way, we have to begin by actively, conceptually opposing the wrong way of seeing things that's the root of our misery. And to do that, we have to really start with words, right? To build up these kinds of concepts. So this is this wrong way of seeing things is, right, an innate, inborn, usually unconscious kind of mistakenness that we all share. And this idea is not unique to Tsongkhapa, or maybe it's even the idea that there's some wrong way we see things that causes us trouble. We usually think of it as maybe unique to Buddhism, but maybe it isn't. This is someone intelligent who wasn't a Buddhist, who wrote, "A human being is part of the whole called the universe, a part limited in time and space." And he, that's, you know, the language that he used, he experiences himself, his thoughts, his feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. Interesting, you know, optical delusion. This delusion, you know, some deluded way of seeing the world, right, is a kind of prison for us. Yeah. Restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons near us. In other words, he's saying, yeah, this is not the way things really are. It's just a trap that we're stuck in. So our job as human beings is to free ourselves from the prison of the delusion by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty. Albert Einstein, right? Not well known as a Buddhist. Or another guy said the three confusions that we're born with and are just seem to be built into, how we are, is that we are the main character in the story that's unfolding right here, right? And that we're separate from everything else that's around. Like we're separate from Nebraska, and we're separate from the swing set in the playground down the street, right? We're separate from each other. And we're just naturally here. It's very difficult for people to imagine the world in their own absence, right? It's just intrinsic or natural to the world that we're here. Of course, we know we're going to die, but we manage to not really work out the contradiction between those, our impermanence and our sense that we're just naturally here. An interesting thing about that, this is maybe a little bit of a tangent, is this research on asking people, how much they've changed in the last 10 years, and then asking people how much they think they'll change in the next 10 years. And generally, when you ask people how much they've changed in the last 10 years, they recognize a huge amount of change. And when you ask them how much they'll change in the next 10 years, they foresee themselves as being sort of like they are now, but older. Yeah, well, you see where that's going, right? Because, the me is the me of this moment, right? Yeah, it's not the me of when I was 17 years old or something like that. So when I'm 70, I'll still be the me of now. I'll just be older. So who is emptiness? We're going to talk more about emptiness. Who is emptiness medicine for? As we know, we said it's not the best medicine for everybody. Right? Some people, it could undermine their confidence, and that the choices they make any kind of real difference. And that's, it's fundamental. It's crucial that we not undermine people's confidence in that way. But on the other hand, it's not that emptiness is just for only a few rare persons, or that it's only for monks and nuns, or maybe traditionally only for monks, and not for other people. There are many texts, and from ancient times and from more modern times, which try in various ways to present emptiness to lay people, like the Questions of King Melinda, is a classical text that where we see a monk who's doing his level best to present the idea of emptiness to a king who's not a Buddhist scholar or monastic, by way of a metaphor of a chariot. And Nagarjuna's Precious Garland is also advice to a king that includes all kinds of teachings on emptiness. Aryadeva's 400 is like that. It's not just like a special insider monastic text. The Vimalikirti Sutra, right, is a sutra that's sort of specifically making the point that the non-dual profundity of emptiness is something that, lay people can understand. Madhyamaka for Midwives was a 20th century scholar of Buddhism who's tried to write a book that, say like ordinary people could understand the philosophy of emptiness. Oh, and then I just put my book in there at the end, Introduction to Emptiness. I tried to explain Tsongkhapa's system in relatively accessible language, right? Yeah. So approaching emptiness, not, what they're different sort of levels of things that one can negate in order to get closer to the profound reality of emptiness. And of course, the first thing is to negate the idea that things are not changing. And people all over the, philosophers all over the world have articulated this. Heraclitus, and I was just actually reading Marcus Aurelius, and there are many other, right, philosophers said it's not just that everybody's going to die and that things are going to break someday, although there's that. It's also the fact that things are constantly changing moment by moment, right? So coarse impermanence means someday the United States will not exist, right? And subtle impermanence means, yeah, the previous instant from the beginning, beginning of the sentence is gone and will never come again. And when we think of, time going by like this, instant, clicking by really quickly, we're not really quite getting to the subtlety of subtle impermanence. We chop time up into minutes or seconds, and the seconds tick away, right? But time doesn't really move like in clicks, right? It's more like looking at a river, and it doesn't click. It's just changing. You can't even say every microsecond. It's changing continuously, unrelentingly, in a kind of ongoing, flowing sort of change. And that subtle impermanence is, something that everybody can sort of think about. And it takes you, the more you think about it, the farther it takes you down the road towards understanding emptiness, I think. Well, just before I go on from that, what do I mean by impermanence taking you towards understanding emptiness? So people will say, yeah, I understand impermanence. Everything changes, things change. Well, but do things change? Do things really change? If things change, then does the table of this moment change and become the table of the next moment? And then it's not really the table. It's not that this table of this moment has changed. It's gone. It's not, right? So maybe it means, right, when we say things change, what it really means is everything's constantly vanishing. Everything's constantly slipping away. And the new instance and new appearances that arise, they don't come out of nowhere. They arise through dependent arising in relationship to the conditions that were there before. But those conditions that were there before are gone, right? And that's happening, right, much faster than we can ever recognize. So in that way, you start thinking about it as like, oh, so impermanence doesn't really mean that things change. It means that there are no things that we can pin down. And as soon as right, there's no things you can pin down, because as soon as you start talking about it, it's already gone and something else there has replaced it. So if you think about impermanence to the point where you realize that it doesn't really mean that things change. It means that there's no things that you can grab, right? Then you're seeing how impermanence is tipping over into emptiness. And then of course we can think about dependent arising, and we'll, understanding dependent arising in different ways. So dependent arising is equivalent to emptiness, we'll say, in that, if things are empty of some independent existence, then the way they exist is interdependent, or dependently they arise instant by instant. And so usually we talk about three ways. There's many ways you could talk about dependent arising, and Actually Nagarjuna's teachings about this are not limited to these three ways, but these are the three classical ways to talk about it: that effects depend on causes, that wholes, which is in Tibetan, just Gyaltsen, which means part possessor. Part possessors depend on parts, and everything depends on mental imputation, right? So it's different ways of thinking about what it means to say that things exist dependently or arise dependently. This one, effects depend on causes, has to do with time, right? And wholes depending on parts is more about space, really, right? But then the last one is the subtlest one and the most challenging, right? To understand how subjects and objects relate to each other, and how objects depend upon subjects. And this is, the way that the world depends upon mind. The idea that the world depends upon mind is very fundamental in Buddhism. You find it in the Dhammapada and many other, and it means different things in different texts, okay? And what it never means is you can just make up any reality you want. It doesn't mean that, right? But this is what I want to try to explain to you. What this subtle meaning of emptiness is related to this idea of what it means for things to depend upon being designated by a mind. So the classical teaching about dependent arising in the first turning of the wheel, in the Khuddaka Nikaya, the Buddha, upon enlightenment, reflected upon the principle of dependent origination and expresses it this way: when this is, that is; this having arisen, that arises; when this is not, that is not; this having ceased, that ceases. And to say that this arises in dependence on that, it sounds pretty superficial until you start really reflecting on it. It means that there isn't anything that doesn't depend on other things. And so therefore it means that there's nothing that exists in and of itself, right? And so it kind of rules out, if you follow from this, it rules out the idea of a God who exists in and of him or herself, who, without depending on anything, just sort of starts the universe up, because that kind of God would be an exception to dependent arising. And Nagarjuna famously in the 24th chapter of the Mula Madhyamaka Karikas equates emptiness and dependent arising. And we lose now, maybe, if we're familiar with this text, we lose maybe the sense of how radical this seemed to people of Nagarjuna's time. They took it that many of the Buddhist philosophers of his time took it that that in order for dependent arising to work, things had to be non-empty. In other words, if something is empty of the ability to produce an effect, then it will produce an effect. If something is truly empty, right, then it will have no oomph or wherewithal. It will not have a latent power within itself to produce an effect. So there has to be something real. There has to be a real seed, or there won't be a real sprout, right? And that was the way people understood it. And so it was radical to say, yeah, this arises in dependence on that, only because not both of them are empty, right? That was not how people thought about dependent arising at all. And it's easy to say dependent arising is a different way of talking about emptiness, and it's really hard to fully understand it. So said His Holiness the Dalai Lama, actually, that exact thing, that this is easy to say and much harder to understand than people think. And so this being the case, some people like Thich Nhat Hanh says that dependent arising does not mean cause and effect, whereas Tsongkhapa and others will say that one meaning of dependent arising is cause and effect. So these people aren't necessarily contradicting each other, right? Thich Nhat Hanh means that dependent arising means when this exists, that can come about, right? And without this, there is no that. It doesn't posit that there's some intrinsic power within this that produces that. And in that sense, a cause is not inherently existent as a producer of an effect. It means something like that, right? Whereas, of course, Tsongkhapa is saying, yeah, all these things are empty, and that's why they're able to work as causes and effect. So in terms of the second type of dependent arising, right, there's the idea that wholes depend on parts, and people recognize that for a long time, but there's this tendency in the mind to keep thinking like, and yeah, when are we going to get down to the smallest part? And so, it was molecules, and then atoms, and then subatomic particles, and then we had quarks. And then people, Time magazine or whatever in those days, right, was saying, now we've discovered the fundamental particle. And then people say, well, how do we account for that fact that there's these different types of quarks which come together in different ways to create these different types of subatomic particles? It must be, which even though we can't see inside the quark, it must be that there's, some kind of arrangement of strings that mathematically makes it possible for there to be, the top quark and the charm quark and so forth. In other words, it's like people keep thinking that if objects are here taking up space, there must be a smallest thing that we can break them down into. And somehow that smallest thing will be the real fundamental thing, and the big things, won't be as real. And there is a lot of talk like that in, for example, in Vaibhashika Buddhism, there's that idea of something that's irreducible, something that can't be broken down any farther, right, as being the ultimate reality. But this kind of atomic theory, breaks down, right? If some hypothetical smallest possible particle existed, it would either take up space or not take up space. If it didn't take up any space, then no matter how many of them you had, you would still not have an object with any extension, would have zero length, because you multiply 0 times a high number, you still have 0. On the other hand, if the object does take up space, even a tiny little bit of space that we can't even see how big that space is, but if it extends, right, then it has a right side or a left side or a top side or a bottom side or east side or a west side, right? And it doesn't exist in and of itself, because what it is like a collection of those different parts, those different sides. It depends upon those, right, to exist. So let me see how we're doing here. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So not seeing things as they are means that we're adding some extra dose of ontological status onto them, right? That's what it means in this system anyway. Things just as they are nakedly, things just as they are in an, is, tatata, a suchness, or tekonani in Tibetan, which would be only thatness, right? Just thatness. And we don't see things that way. We don't see them just as they are. And instead, we superimpose an extra layer of, say, ontological mayonnaise on top. And that's the, right? That's the distortion or confusion. That's the root of cyclic existence. It's that we've added on something extra. And that this is the problem, of course, is that this extra ontological mayonnaise that we put over the top is then a growth medium for all of the other afflictions. Like, so when, you know, someone is competing with me for a parking space and they get into the parking space first, or if someone seems to be cutting in front of me in line as I'm, you know, waiting to get into the ladies' room, then I can I can see that person as just being naturally or inherently the kind of asshole who would do such a shitty thing, right? It's and my anger comes up toward them, and I think, well, of course I'm not going to you know, shoot them, for God's sake. I'm not going to maybe you know, I'm not going to cuss at them because I'm, you know, a good Buddhist or whatever. But the fact is that it appears at that time that they are suitable to be harmed. They're not like my precious long lost mother. They're like naturally existing from their own side as a person who really deserves to suffer as a consequence of their bad behavior, right? And so it's like that. You know, I'm using the anger example, and you know, road rage, and comes out of not seeing things realistically, but in you know, of course, you know, people have differences, right? But there's a difference between having differences and then exaggerating the reality of the people with whom we're disagreeing, so that we see them as demons. And that's how, you know, countries get people to go to war. People don't just wake up in the morning and think, you know, it'd be a good idea to machine gun some of my fellow human beings. They have to be taught very carefully, inculcated with the view that these are not really your fellow human beings. They're not your kin. They're scum and they're demons. And the fewer of them, they're vermin. The more of them we can get rid of, the better we'll purify the world. And people begin to adopt this view, and then it becomes suitable to destroy, because they've been taught to add this extra layer of, you know, mayonnaise on to the enemy, which is that they're naturally evil, right? And they're, yeah, it's not just other human beings with whom we have a slight disagreement over where the property line is, right? They're spawn of Satan. Yeah, I can see maybe I should stop pretty soon, so that if people have any questions. I just I'll give you this last quote, and then I guess next time we'll have to get into talking about the details of Tsongkhapa's view. And then maybe the time after that, we can start looking into some of these other views of profound reality. The view of Tsongkhapa, following that of Chandrakirti in the so-called Prasangika Madhyamaka tradition, is that you do not have to be a bodhisattva. You do not have to be a bodhisattva to realize the profound emptiness that is the ultimate reality. That non-bodhisattvas, people who are practitioners of a lesser vehicle, right? And so, you know, therefore, by extension, Theravadins or early Buddhists who didn't have access to the Mahayana sutras, these people could realize emptiness. Not a lot of Mahayana Buddhists say, no, they couldn't. They're realizing some sort of coarse emptiness. They're not realizing the true profound emptiness. But Chandrakirti says, no, they're realizing the profound emptiness, right? So then an interesting thing is try to say, well, you know, if we can find the teaching of the profound emptiness in the, you know, early teachings of Buddha, not just the Mahayana Sutras, where do we find them, right? And there are places, right? And I just wanted to show you one. Mara, the evil one, desiring to arouse fear, trepidation, and terror in the Bhikkhuni Vajira, and desiring to make her fall away from concentration, approached her and addressed her in verse. By whom has this being been created? You know, who are you really? Where's the maker of this being? Where has the being arisen? Where does the being cease? Recognizing, Vajira replies, why now do you assume in all these questions the objective existence of some being? Have you grasped at a view? This is a heap of sheer constructions. There's no being ultimately to be found, right? just as with the assemblage of parts, we use the word chariot, we apply the word chariot, conveniently to an assemblage of parts, no one of which is a chariot. So it is that when the aggregates of mind and body are present, it's appropriate to use the convention, a being, but you can't pin down exactly who or what this being is. And in this way, we see that Vajira, the bhikkhuni, is represented in the Pali Canon as using the chariot example to explain, I would say, emptiness, just as it's later used in the questions of King Milinda, and then elaborated later by Chandrakirti in his commentaries on Nagarjuna. Well, I have a lot more to share, but I feel like I should stop talking for now, because I could talk for a lot longer, but I feel like maybe you'll get tired of listening. And we can do it again next week. He's like, you've hardly gotten started. That's right. It's true, but it's important to do a little stage setting. We'll have time to break down, the Tsongkhapa's subtle distinctions next time. I wanted to, I think it's important to frame the discussion in terms of, how I see this fitting into the tradition and making sense of the tradition, and also, how it's very easy when we get into these technical things about, what it means to say that all things are mere imputations by thought. It starts to can feel removed from kindness. And I want to frame everything like that. It's all this is only for the purpose of becoming more effective in our ways to help other beings. Okay, questions?
Yes, may I ask a question, please?
Yes.
The impermanent phenomena, if it has within its nature to change, from moment to moment, and to disintegrate moment to moment, if that is the case, why would impermanent phenomena need even causes and condition externally?
Oh, why would they need causes and conditions other than themselves if the very nature of each phenomena is to disintegrate? That's a question, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so suppose this is very hypothetical, right? Because it's not the way the world is. But suppose there was just this one thing that had in its nature to arise and disintegrate, then so you're saying that, like, there could be another phenomenon in the next moment that would have it in its nature to arise and disintegrate, right? And another phenomenon in the next instant that would have it in its nature to arise and disintegrate. So in other words, each phenomenon as it arose, because it had in its nature to arise and disintegrate, would just arise by way of its own nature and wouldn't have to depend. And therefore, anything could appear any place at any time.
Maybe not the first moment of arising. Once it has arisen, it doesn't seem to need anything else.
So when you say this first moment of arising, so there's a thing that's going to continue to exist over time?
No, once something has a reason through some kind of cause and conditions, it has within its nature to disintegrate.
Yeah.
Does not need additional causes and conditions to disintegrate.
That's
the part that struck me when I really think about what it means to be impermanent. Yeah. The subtle impermanence.
Yeah, things are constantly slipping away moment by moment, but they don't slip away they, in the process of slipping away instant by instant, or even faster than that, right? They serve as the ground or environment or context in which the next moments appear. So things have it, you could say it's the nature of things to arise and disintegrate, but they don't arise without depending upon prior instance, right? Everything arises in dependence on, that's dependent arising. Things arise in dependence on this, arises in dependence on that. So, you know, it's true that this will disintegrate in and of itself, but it doesn't appear out of nowhere. It appears in dependence upon something else.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, causes and condition, you know, we Buddhists say that so casually. It's like we just swing.
Yeah.
But I just realized that there is a moment after the initial arising, the causes and condition or cause and effect no longer applies, because it just carry within its own nature that disintegration.
So I could be wrong, you know, about what you're thinking, but there is this whole way of talking within Buddhism about there being three moments within the existence of a thing: the moment of its arising, the moment of its subsisting, and the moment of its disintegration, right? There is that way of talking, but you have to understand that's a very provisional way of talking. In Prasangika, all of these things are simultaneous. There isn't like, they aren't separated in time. It wouldn't make sense for them to be separated in time, because if they were separated in time, then it would no longer be a single instant. You're talking about three things now instead of, right? And so this construction of, like, you know, very tiny dharmas having one moment when they arise, a second moment when they subsist, and a third moment when they disintegrate, that way of understanding, as you say, is modified, right? And so it's still, yeah, things arise and disintegrate, but this happens, yeah, in one moment.
Yeah, the three moments, they are not separate, but they cannot be simultaneous. If they are simultaneous, then we are always fixed in time in that one moment. There wouldn't be progression of time.
So yeah, if they can't be, yeah, this is a good problem. I mean, what you're talking about maybe is analyzing subtle impermanence in a way that leads towards analytical unfindability, right? Because you're saying, if this moment just like I was saying about the molecule, like an atom, if it either has extension or doesn't have extension, right? And either way, it's impossible to build up a table, right, out of all these tiny little things. If they have zero space, then you can't do it. And if they have, you know, tiny bit of space, you can always break it apart. Well, you're discovering exactly the same thing about time. Right? You're doing, you're understanding, actually, I think, the same thing that I was trying to explain earlier, how thinking deeply about subtle impermanence realizes that you can't really pin down things, what a thing is that's changing, right? To say that things change is just a coarse or convenient way to talk about impermanence. But what is this thing? Does it exist for a certain amount of time, or does it not exist for any amount of time? If it exists for no amount of time, then what are we talking about it even existing at all? If it exists for a finite amount of time, it extends over time. Then it has a beginning, middle, and end. It's not really a single thing. It's a bunch of different things that are succeeding each other really quickly. You see what I'm saying? It's like, well, you have this problem. It's like it can't be ultimately findable in either way. It's true that this is true with a lot of things, by the way. When you analyze deeper, instead of just the words that we're used to using, things get less clear rather than clear. And this is actually talked about in the Madhyamaka texts. If things had their own nature, and His Holiness likes to talk about this a lot too, so if things had their own nature, then when we looked at them very, very closely and tried to pin down exactly how they worked, they should get completely clear, because we would see what that nature is. And in fact, it gets murkier and murkier and more confusing. And it seems to be self-contradictory. And that's because they don't have their own nature, and you can never find or pin down what that nature is. And most of the time, we don't analyze deeply enough to realize that. But that's what you're doing. It's a problem, right? It's a problem is that there's a gap between our way of thinking and talking and the way stuff actually exists.
So that's the answer to my question.
I think that is the answer. Yeah. Yeah. What I'm saying is that you have the problem, you've come up against the problem of if a thing extends in time, then you can break it down into separate moments and say that each of those is a separate thing. Or if it doesn't extend in time, then it doesn't exist at all.
Well, I wasn't thinking about the time aspect at all, actually. I was just simply thinking about the fact that it just struck me some time ago, I mean, a short while ago, about the implication of impermanence. An impermanent phenomena does not, once it exists, it does not need outside causes and conditions for it to disintegrate, because it has within its own nature to disintegrate. Like a flower, we cut a flower, put it in a vase, and then through time we can see that it just wither. We don't need anything else to do anything else to the flower. And for some reason, it just struck me that it doesn't need extra causes and conditions for it to disintegrate. I do not know the implication of that, but it just struck me as, I don't know, a wow thing.
Yeah, yeah. I understand your point. Yeah. It's like, yeah, we're naturally getting older just by ourselves, right? Yeah. We don't need to have somebody else come in from the outside and make us older day by day. Yeah. Yeah. So no more questions? Do you have
Nadine, did you have a question? I see your hand was up before, and Mikhail, have you?
Yeah, it was a question, but I wasn't sure if we were going to end at 5:30, so I put my hand down. But I've read the translation on Lamrim's several times, and I don't know if this is an important question or not, but since it's in the book and I try to understand the book, who's Huashang? Was he a Chan Buddhist? Was he a Zen Buddhist? Like, who was this famous person, this infamous Huashang that you talk about?
Oh, Huashang. Yeah, Huashang Mahayana. Well, he might have been historical. I mean, it's not really, some scholars treat him as likely to have been a real historical person. There's a lot of argument, you know, who knows, right? The story is that there was a debate, right? And that Huashang Mahayana essentially represented something like some people say like a Chan view, but I don't know if that's fair to Chan Buddhism. It's sort of a view that all dualistic thought is the source, right, of our ensnaredness. And then therefore, in order to be liberated, it's not a matter of correcting our thoughts or using logic to try to understand how things exist. What we should do is, go into like a thoughtless condition, right? And so he's represented as having argued that point against Kamalashila in a debate in Lhasa. And Kamalashila is saying, no, you have to use logic. We Madhyamikas say that you use logic to deconstruct and show the unsustainability of our ordinary way of thinking about the world. And then on the basis of that, you cultivate samadhi, but you don't just like think that a samadhi of thoughtlessness is going to liberate you. And so.
Okay, thanks. Every time I read it, I'm like, who's this guy?
Well, it's interesting because in the text, in Lamrim Chemo, Tsongkhapa trashes the views of many prior Tibetans without naming them and calling them. He's not only does he not call them names, he doesn't name them. He's not interested in criticizing people. He's criticizing certain views, right? And the only person, maybe I'm misremembering, but as far as I remember, the only specific person, earlier Tibetan that he criticizes by name is Hashang, right? And so Hashang functions.
Yeah, a little bit of Baba Viveka, a little bit of Baba Viveka, little bit we feel, I don't know.
Okay, so Baba Viveka is, that's why I said earlier Tibetans. Well, he criticizes Baba Viveka for, but he also praises Baba Viveka quite a lot. But in terms of misunderstanding the view he thinks all of these earlier Tibetans have failed to understand what Chandrakirti was really getting at, even when they say they're followers of Chandrakirti, right? And the only person that he names as, having one of those wrong views is Hashang. So I think of him, he may have been a real historical person and there may have been a real debate, but as far as the text goes, he functions as I want to say a straw man, but he functions as a target. He functions as a person who represents a view that Tsongkhapa really wants to defeat, right? And he focuses on that because I assume that it's because that was a pervasive problem at the time he was teaching, right? That people thought that
was our suspicion, and I'm so glad we got to talk to you. Of the book, because we were like, oh my God, we'll never know. So thank you. There's
things written about it. Some people say that, look at it as a legend or a fable even about this debate in Hashang. But other people look at it as like, well, this could really have happened. I honestly don't know, and it hasn't been my interest to try to sort it out. I'm more interested in the ideas than the history part of it. But it's true that even, there's always been, okay, so like, I put these three views, and the third one could go in kind of a Hashang direction. I don't want to equate it to Hashang, but the idea of just saying, we have to stop holding views altogether. Anytime you have a conception or a thought or a view, you're already worse off than before. So just stop all that, right? And that's how Hashang is he represents that point of view. And some people say that those things that are like that within the Buddhist tradition, even today. Yeah. Okay. Did you say?
All right, thank you so much.
Oh, sure.
Really, thank you.
Yeah, if you have other questions about the actual Lamrim Chemo, that's good. I'm glad you've read it. Okay, it's not like that I have to go, but so if somebody else has a question, I'm happy to answer it. But I was like give people permission to leave since it's past the time that we said we would stop. Okay. Did you have a clue? We were going to say
we were under the assumption that we were on the assumption that Lamrim Chemo was written by monks for monks.
It was written by monks for monks.
Yeah, because in the beginning it's pretty it's heavily male. In a way. I mean, we understand that the Buddha himself didn't make a distinction, but it was like, woo, it's pretty. It's a little right. maybe the wrong medicine at the wrong time for the wrong person. So we went with the perspective of it's by monks, for monks. So let's overlook that part, you know.
Oh yeah, there's some stuff
yeah.
that might not be the best. But I mean, the best for particular people. But it's also important. I think it's worth something that's meaningful to me is some of the things that he says in the text about like you should take all of these things, even the really complicated things that I say, as personal instructions. I mean, when he wrote that book, he had been writing other books and meditating and doing prostrations for a very long time, trying to work all this out. And he wants to, you know, whisper in our ears some, you know, personal information, right? And he tells us that you should take all of these teachings as personal instructions. Now you can take them all as personal instructions and say, I have no idea what to do with that personal instruction right now. But that is, you know what I'm saying? That is how he's trying to say that this isn't, I'm not just wool gathering philosopher here. All of this relates to your spiritual practice. And another huge thing that for him along that line is that he sees a lot of people, you know, trying to just start practicing Tantra right away or they want to have the Prasangika view because it's the highest view right away, right? And he's like, well, you know, you should think about, you know, the qualities of the spiritual teacher and the workings of karma, and you know, and all of these, understand all of these practices as critical parts of even the most advanced path. And he says in the book, he says, might be at the very end. He says, it's a sign of progress if when you go to a higher level, you feel inspired to go back to an earlier level and practice that again more deeply. I'm paraphrasing, but that's in the very end of the third volume. And
It's about book 3, yeah.
I think that's quite profound. You know, it's like, I know people who, I have Buddhist friends who will not talk about the Four Noble Truths. Because that's like, they see that as like going back to kindergarten. And I'm like, no, I don't really think that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah. Okay. I'll see you next week. It'll be fun. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye.
Professor Newland. Thank you, everybody.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
We'll continue next week.
Thank you for
Same time.
inviting me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
See you
It's
next
been
week.
wonderful. All right.
And we'll save our questions till then.
Okay. Did you want to, if people have a reserve of questions, I guess we could start with questions next time. But if we don't, I'll start going deeper into trying to explain Tsongkhapa's view. I see a couple of people put chat messages. Oh yeah, but those aren't questions. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.